name is Andrew Hopkins, and I'm a member of CCL, but I'm also a retired sociologist from the Australian National University in Canberra, and I live in Canberra. My research has been in the area of the sociological causes of major accidents. So I'm not a climate change expert. I'm absolutely a novice, like most of you. So with that, let me move on to the topic I want to talk about today, which is getting rural MPs to support carbon pricing. One of the objectives of CCL is to create a non-partisan climate solutions caucus in the Australian Federal Parliament. This is also the policy in the US, to create a bipartisan or non-partisan environment where these matters can be discussed. And the aim in the US is to create a caucus with equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. At the moment, that caucus is building. They have 70 plus members, and so this is an ongoing process. The challenge, however, is to get Republicans to join the caucus because they're rather less sympathetic to the sorts of climate concerns that many of us in CCL have, even though our policies in CCL are specifically designed to appeal to both sides of the political divide. So the challenge in the US has been to get Republicans to join the caucus. Now, we have the same process that we're seeking to get underway in Australia. There is in Australia a ready-made mechanism in the Australian Federal Parliament to create these bipartisan groups, and they are called the Parliamentary Friends. That's the mechanism. So we have Parliamentary Friends of the ABC, Parliamentary Friends of Science, Parliamentary Friends of the Australian Head of State, and so on. These are recognised groups. To create such a group, parliamentarians have to identify 10 people who want to join the group. It has to be bipartisan. They have to nominate chairs from both sides of politics. And then once you recognise, you have certain rights and privileges as a recognised parliamentary group. So our aim is to encourage parliamentarians to create a Parliamentary Friends for Climate Solutions. So this is a very concrete aim that CCL has. But as in the US, the challenge is to get more conservatively inclined people to join this caucus because they're, in principle, at least initially, more resistant than people on the opposite side of politics might be. So for CCL in Canberra, we've taken this to be the principal challenge which we're seeking to address in the first instance. And we have 4 parliamentary representatives in the ACT. 3 are Labor and 1 is Conservative. A Liberal politician, Liberal senator, his name is Senator Zed Seselja. So our aim has been to try and focus on Zed and get him to think about the idea, CCL's ideas, and to consider joining a Parliamentary Friends of Climate Solutions. So when we began thinking about this, we said to ourselves, well, what are his interests? What are the points of contact that we might have with him? And we discovered that he has an interest in land care and tree planting. This is amongst his swag of many interests that he has. Now, tree planting, we thought, wow, this is our point of contact, because tree planting is about storing carbon, and this is precisely what carbon farming is about. So this is our point of contact with Zed that we thought we'd seek to exploit and develop. We haven't had a chance to talk to him about this yet, but we hope to do so in the not too distant future. But in thinking about this, I realised that this would be an excellent way for CCL to appeal to people on the conservative side of politics in general, and in particular the rural MPs and National Party MPs who represent rural electorates. So this same idea, I thought, would be useful for CCL in approaching those kinds of politicians. So that's really the genesis of this talk and the genesis of these ideas. So let's talk about carbon farming. What is carbon farming? Well, there are 2 components to it. One is reducing carbon emissions from existing farming activities, and the other is drawing down carbon from the atmosphere, that is sequestering carbon in the ground. So those 2 different strands, they're equally important strands of carbon farming. To make it real, let's think of some examples. And the examples I'm going to give you are sourced from this very important document put out by the Carbon Market Institute in Australia. It's the Carbon Farming Industry Roadmap, and it's a document worth studying if you want to pursue these ideas further. So the examples I'm going to give you are drawn from this document. So here are a few examples, first of all from agriculture. Reducing emissions from cattle through dietary supplements or efficient herd management. The point here is that ruminant animals produce a lot of methane, actually from both ends of the animal, and that is a very significant contributor to the overall greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So, but it's been found that with various dietary supplements, that contribution of methane can be reduced. So this is one little example, if you like, but a significant example. I'll give you several more. Capturing and destroying the methane from effluent waste at piggeries. Now this is very much underway at the moment in Australia. That piggeries, the manure from piggeries is fed down a slide into a small dam, a covered dam, and the methane, which is given off in that environment, is drawn off and then used to generate electricity. So these kinds of activities are currently underway in Australia. So these are real examples of what is at work in Australia at the moment. Most importantly, I think, is the more general concept of building soil carbon through changed farming practices such as crop stubble retention. Now, in this particular example I'm talking about here, I'm referring to the fact that farmers who grow crops will often, when they've harvested those crops, they're left with crop stubble, and they will simply burn the crop stubble at the end of the season, which creates vast quantities of smoke and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and also involves a depletion of the soil. Now, if we can encourage farmers not to burn that stubble, but rather to plough it back in, that will not only reduce carbon emissions into the atmosphere, but it will build soil carbon, which is really a real benefit to farmers in the longer term. Several other examples that are worth just mentioning. One of them is the regeneration of native forest on previously cleared land. That's a carbon sink idea. Protecting native forests by avoiding land clearing if they were going to be cut down, and we can protect the native forest, then that reduces emissions into the atmosphere. Planting trees to grow carbon stocks is an obvious example. Another one that I came across recently is the notion of savanna burning in northern Australia. In northern Australia, at the end of the hot season, the fire season, a lot of the savanna land will burn with high intensity fires. Now, the way to reduce that, and this is something this knowledge we owe to Aboriginals who've managed these grasslands for thousands of years. If you mosaic burn them, patchwork burn them early in the season, you will reduce the intensity of the late season fires, and so this will reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So these are some of the ideas that are covered by the concept of carbon farming. So then the next question is, well, why should farmers do this? Why should they bother? And they'll only do it, or at least the best way to encourage them really is to make sure that this is profitable for them. So how can we make it profitable? So what I want to talk about now is making carbon farming profitable for farmers. To encourage them, this is one of the benefits. The profit will be one of the benefits, but there will be other benefits as well. So how to make it profitable to reduce emissions or sequester carbon? Now, government policy in this area is developed, and I think over a number of years, I think it's actually quite clever. So there are several steps in the policy, and it's a bit complicated, so bear with me while I go through these steps. The first step is to commodify emissions reduction and carbon sequestration. What do I mean by that? I mean, if farmers are going to reduce their emissions, they need to be able to turn around and say, we've got something to sell. And so the idea here is to commodify it so they can then sell what it is they've done. So that's the basic idea, to commodify emissions reduction and carbon sequestration so that the farmers have a commodity which they can then sell into some kind of market. So how do they do that? Well, the government has set up a system called Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACUs. And the idea here is that when, if carbon farmers or farmers can demonstrate either that they have reduced emissions or that they've sequestered carbon, demonstrated by a rigorous accounting mechanism which the government now has developed, then the government will issue them with these credit units, these Australian carbon credit units, 1 unit for every tonne of CO2 or CO2 equivalent which they have reduced or sequestered. So this is the way in which they can, those credits then, those credit units become the commodity which they can then sell. So that's the first step, to find a way to commodify these carbon farming activities. The second step is to create a buyer for these AQs. So who's going to buy these things? Well, again, we go back, the government policy has created a buyer. We go back to Tony Abbott, Prime Minister, in 2014 when he abolished the Labor's carbon tax. Abbott was still committed to the notion of reducing emissions into the atmosphere and carbon abatement. So he set up the Emissions Reduction Fund, which was funded out of budget. And this was a fund which would be used to buy those AQs. So here is the first buyer. We have an emissions reduction fund created by government precisely for that purpose. Now, the ERF, Emissions Reduction Fund, how does it buy these AQs? Well, what it does is run an auction process, a reverse auction process, and it says to farmers and anyone else who wants to sell AQs, all right, tell us what price you will need for us to pay you to engage in these carbon farming activities. And farmers will then bid in this reverse auction process and bid the lowest price which they will need to make it worth their while to engage in these carbon farming activities. The government then looks at the bids and takes the lowest bids and says, all right, we'll fund these ones because that way we get the maximum, the greatest carbon reduction or carbon abatement for our limited funds. And those people will then get funded. They then begin their carbon abatement program, their carbon farming activities, secure in the knowledge that when they are successful, they will be given the AQs and the government will buy their AQs at that agreed price. Now, the interesting thing then is, what is that agreed price? And the last price at the last auction was $12 a tonne. The average price was $12 a tonne of CO2 abated. So that's the carbon price in that particular market. There's nothing magical about that carbon price. It just happens to be the price at which farmers are willing to begin their carbon abatement activities. If they can get $12 a tonne, then it is worth their while to start those carbon abatement activities. So the government then has been the primary buyer of AQs up until now. But this is where the next step comes in, and I think it's also a very important step in the process, which is about creating new buyers of AQs other than the government. And here we go back to another Abbott-era policy, the safeguard mechanism. Now, this was a policy designed to cap emissions from Australia's largest industrial emitters. These are big coal mines, big industrial enterprises, some power generation companies or facilities. Some of these very big emitters are responsible for a large proportion of Australian emissions. Indeed, about half of Australian emissions come from 150 very large industrial emitters. And the policy was to prevent them from going on increasing their emissions. The idea was that if we are going to pay farmers and others to reduce emissions, we don't want that benefit cancelled out by the big emitters simply increasing their emissions over time. So if we want to avoid that process of cancelling out whatever benefits we've achieved through the emissions reduction fund, we must have a safeguard mechanism in place. We must put a cap on the big emitters to stop them from increasing their emissions. And so that was what the safeguard mechanism was all about, to hold those emissions steady. The cap was placed at the current emission level for those big emitters, and they were held not to go over that limit. But what if they did go over that limit? This is the important question. If they did go over that limit, then they would be required to buy AQs in the market to compensate for their excess emissions. They would then buy those AQs and surrender them to government, if you like, as a penalty for having gone over their cap. Now, that policy is now beginning to bite, and was in operation for the first year, and in March this year, the government announced that in that first year of operation, I think it was 16 of the largest emitters had gone over their caps. They were in excess, and they had therefore had to buy 448,000 AQs to compensate for their excess emissions. And among those very big emitters that had to buy these AQs were these four companies. If you look at them, you'll see three of them are big coal mining companies. One's an aluminium smelter, but the other three are big coal mining companies. So coal's very much implicated in these companies. It's very much a part of the process of going over the cap in Australia at the present time. Now, where did these companies, they had to buy AQs to compensate for their excess. Where did they get their AQs from? Well, it turns out that some of the successful bidders in a previous government auction, the Emissions Reduction Fund auction, some of those successful bidders actually produced more AQs than they had bid for. So they had excess AQs still to sell. And so they were very interested in selling them to these big emitters who were interested in buying them. So we're matching now suppliers with purchasers, with buyers. And so the big emitters began to buy excess AQs from these farmers. What price did they pay? The price that they were having to pay for these AQs, because they were in relatively short supply, was $14 to $15 a tonne. Remember that the last ERF auction was $12 a tonne, so they are now having to pay slightly more than that auction price to buy the AQs which they need. And as their deadline for compliance approached and their need to buy these AQs became more acute, the price increased, and the price increased ultimately to $17 or $18 a tonne, which is 50% higher than the auction price. So we have therefore a second carbon market in operation. As well as the Emissions Reduction Fund auction, we have this market created by the safeguard mechanism and the need of big emitters to be able to buy carbon credits to compensate for their excess emissions. So this is very good news. This is exciting news for carbon farmers, and the more of these buyers that can be created, the more profitable it will be for carbon farmers to apply their minds to how to reduce emissions and how to sequester carbon. So this is very much a step in the right direction, both for farmers and for climate change. How could this be developed? How can this new market be developed? Well, one way to do it is to progressively lower that cap on the big emitters. if that cap is progressively lowered, those big emitters will have to find ways to reduce their emissions and or buy more AQs as time goes on. So that's a very important suggestion, that we progressively lower the cap on the big emitters over time. Now, that is not government policy. I need to stress that is not current government policy. A lot of commentators have suggested that it ought to be, that we need to be progressively lowering those caps for the sake of the climate, but it is not current government policy. However, what I'm arguing is it would be good policy for MPs with rural constituents, for example, the Nationals. And this is where CCL's interests, if you like, overlap with MPs with rural constituents, because we in CCL want those caps driven lower, and at the same time that will generate more AQs, greater demand for AQs, I should say, to the benefit of carbon farmers. So our interests then are very much aligned with the interests of rural MPs in this matter. There are other government policies which will also drive increased demand for AQs, for carbon credits. For example, the National Energy Guarantee will, if it comes into operation, will allow for the power generators to meet some of their requirements by buying AQs. So there will be other demands for AQs coming from other government policies. So this is not. So this is an evolving market, if you like. This private sector market, is an evolving market for AQs. And the interesting thing is that if this private demand for AQs can be strengthened in that way, eventually there will be no need for the government funding through the ERF auctions any longer, because the demand from the private sector will outstrip the sale of AQs via the auction process. And if that happens, there will be no further draw on the government budget to encourage farmers to engage in carbon farming. The incentives will come entirely from the private sector seeking to buy AQs to offset their emissions. So this is an exciting policy development, which is quite different from most of what we hear in the media these days, which is about power generation and the need to reduce emissions from power generators. This is a very different focus for CCL to be thinking about. Let me step back a minute and just acknowledge that there are various controversies associated with carbon farming. It's not all plain sailing. It's not all without controversy, without debate and disagreement. So, for example, if we go back to some of those examples I put on the screen earlier, under vegetation, we have regenerating native forest on previously cleared land. Now, there are people who object to this. If you have previously cleared farmland and you allow it to lie fallow so that it can regenerate, one of the things that happens is you grow a lot of weeds on that land. And neighbouring farmers object to this. So the other thing that happens is if you tie up a lot of land which was previously quite intensively used for farming and was creating employment, then you are reducing employment in that immediate region. So there are winners and losers. There are controversies associated with that policy. I think even more obviously the idea of protecting native forests by avoiding land clearing. Should we really be paying farmers not to clear land? A much more effective strategy is simply to proceed by regulation and say, you may not clear this land, it's prohibited to clear this land. So there are other ways of protecting native forests other than by using a market mechanism. So there are controversies and debates to be had, but I don't think any of that detracts from the basic message that I'm presenting you with today. Let me take another step back from this and ask the question, why is carbon farming so important from a climate change point of view? Well, the answer is this. Most of the policies we see, particularly around the power generation sector, are about reducing emissions to zero. We want to reduce power generation emissions. We want to reduce transport emissions ultimately to zero if we possibly can. That's very important to do all that. But it's actually, we need further. That will not be enough. That will not be enough because there is already too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we are going to get global warming, substantial global warming, even if we can reduce emissions to zero. So we need to go beyond zero emissions and start to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And that's what carbon farming can contribute. It can contribute to the reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the sequestration of carbon in biological forms in the soil. That's why carbon farming is so important, because it goes beyond zero emissions to help us draw down carbon from the atmosphere, which we need to do, desperately need to do, if we are to stabilise the planet. Let me finish then with just, I think I want to talk about a grand vision of carbon farming, and this is Tim Flannery's grand vision, in which he outlines in his latest book, Sunlight and Seaweed. And he sees our solution to drawing down carbon from the atmosphere as farming seaweed on a gigantic scale. And what he proposes that we should be farming is giant kelp, which is a very rapidly growing form of seaweed. It's the fastest growing form of seaweed. Kelp is familiar to us. It's the kind of seaweed which washes up on beaches. It has little flotation bubbles attached to it. And giant kelp is a form of that. And so the idea is that we should be growing giant kelp in vast farms in mid-ocean. The carbon farmers, whoever they may be, will need to construct frames which will float about 25 metres below the surface of the ocean. The seaweed, the kelp will grow there. Those frames can be drawn to the surface every 3 months or so, and the kelp can be cut off because it grows so rapidly. It will be harvestable after 3 months. You cut it off. You then cut the bubbles off, those flotation bubbles off the kelp, and the kelp will then sink to the bottom of the ocean. And if that ocean bottom is more than 1 kilometre below, then the kelp will stay there virtually forever. So this is a virtually permanent means of carbon sequestration. And the kelp grows by drawing carbon dioxide out of the ocean, and so that will leave the ocean free to withdraw more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So it's all a system that works in this way. It's a very promising strategy. If done on a large enough scale, it would be a very large scale that would be necessary to make the kind of impact we need, but it's theoretically possible. The other benefits that you might derive out of this is that kelp which you harvest, rather than dropping it over the side and allowing it to sink to the bottom of the ocean, you could process it and create biofuels out of it. Biofuels, and then the residue from that is biochar, which is a fairly stable form of carbon, which can then be, if you're in mid-ocean, all you could do with that is throw that over the edge, and it will then sink as well. So there are different things you can do in that respect. And the other benefit is that the kelp growing on this, vast quantities of kelp growing on these frames will be habitat for sea fish and fish, which can be harvested and sold in the market. So there are a lot of side benefits that will accrue from Tim Flannery's grand carbon farming vision. Ultimately, however, it will only work if there is some kind of price on carbon that will be paid to the carbon farmers to go ahead with this project. And really, the only way that'll happen is if governments are willing to subsidise it on a very big scale. But that really is what has to happen if we are to save the planet. I think that strategy of subsidising these carbon farmers in the way I've just described really points to a limitation of CCL's carbon fee and dividend strategy, which we need to think about in the future, perhaps not right now. But the point about carbon fee and dividend is that all of the fee, all of the dividend that is generated from those fees must go back to the citizens. That's a fundamental part of the carbon fee and dividend. You're not allowed to take out of that fee a portion of it to pay for other activities, no matter how desirable they may be. And so that's really, we can't really use any of that fee to fund the seaweed vision that Tim Flannery has. I think that's a limitation. It points to a need for development in our thinking, new policies in CCL which can take these kinds of things into account. But that's really a matter for the future. So thank you very much.